Hello, weary traveler, wherever you find yourself tonight. Are you tucked beneath soft blankets in a warm bedroom, perhaps with the gentle glow of a bedside lamp casting shadows on familiar walls? Or maybe you're listening in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world feels suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. Take a moment to notice where you are, the temperature of the air around you, the sounds drifting in from outside your window, the weight of comfort that surrounds you. I wonder what time it is in your corner of the world. Is it the deep velvet of midnight, when thoughts turn inward and the day's worries begin to dissolve? Perhaps it's those precious twilight hours when darkness settles like a gentle blanket over the earth, inviting rest and reflection. Wherever you are, whatever hour has brought you here, you are welcome in this quiet space we're about to share. If you find yourself returning to these stories night after night, drawn to these gentle explorations of our shared human past, I invite you to join our community of Midnight Wanderers. There's something comforting about knowing others are listening to, finding solace in these whispered tales of long ago. But for now, simply let yourself settle deeper into this moment, this story, this bridge between your present and our collective yesterday. Tonight, we journey together into shadows, not the familiar darkness of your bedroom, but the profound, unforgiving darkness that once defined entire lives. We're going to explore something that might disturb the comfortable assumptions we hold about human resilience and the progress of civilization. We're going to step into a world where the simple accident of being born without sight, or losing your hearing to fever or injury, meant something far more terrible than inconvenience or challenge. We're going to discover why, for most of human history, being deaf or blind wasn't simply a disability, was a death sentence written in the cruel grammar of survival, executed by societies that had no room for difference, no understanding of accommodation, and often no mercy for those who could not contribute to the desperate daily struggle of staying alive. But don't worry, dear listener. Though our journey will take us through difficult territory, we'll walk this path together, softly, contemplatively. There will be moments of unexpected light, stories of remarkable souls who somehow survived against impossible odds, and gentle reminders of how far we've traveled from those harsh ancient shores. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare to witness both the cruelty and the occasional, precious humanity of our ancestors. Picture yourself, if you will, standing at the edge of human consciousness roughly 8,000 years ago, when the first permanent settlements were taking root along river valleys, when agriculture was still a recent miracle, and when every sunrise represented another day of survival wrested from an indifferent world. The morning air carries the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, the distant sound of grinding grain, the low voices of people beginning their daily battle against hunger, disease, and death. You are witnessing the birth of civilization, but not as we imagine it in our comfortable modern narratives of progress and human ingenuity. This is civilization born of desperation, forged in the white-hot crucible of necessity, where every calorie consumed must be earned, every mouth fed must contribute, and every member of the community must pull their weight in the endless struggle to survive another harsh winter, another failed harvest, another epidemic that could wipe out half a village in a matter of weeks. In this world, you quickly learn, there is no room for weakness. There is no safety net. There is no concept of rights or accommodations or the inherent dignity of human life, regardless of ability. There is only the brutal mathematics of survival. Those who can hunt, gather, plant, harvest, weave, cook, fight, and procreate, and those who cannot, those who contribute to the tribe's chances of seeing another season, and those who diminish them. Now imagine, in this unforgiving landscape, the profound vulnerability of a child born without sight. Picture the moment when parents first realize their infant cannot see their faces, cannot track the movement of their hands, cannot navigate the world that requires constant vigilance against predators, natural disasters, and human enemies. Or envision the devastating realization when a young adult, previously healthy and productive, loses their hearing to disease or injury, suddenly cut off from the crucial communication that coordinates hunts, warns of danger, and maintains the social bonds that hold the group together. These are not the challenges we might imagine overcoming with determination and adaptive technology. These are death sentences delivered by the simple, implacable logic of a world that has not yet learned to separate human worth from immediate utility. In ancient times, to be deaf or blind was to become what anthropologists grimly call excess population. Individuals whose survival consumed resources without contributing equivalent value to the group's collective chances of survival. The archaeological record whispers these harsh truths to us across the millennia. In excavations of ancient settlements, researchers find the remains of individuals with disabilities buried differently from their peers, often in less elaborate graves, sometimes outside the main burial areas, occasionally showing signs of having died much younger than would be expected from their physical remains. These are the silent testimonies of lives that were deemed expendable, of human beings whose worth was measured solely by their ability to contribute to immediate survival needs. But to truly understand the weight of this tragedy, we must look beyond the cold statistics of ancient burials and step into the lived experience of what it meant to navigate an ancient world without sight or hearing. We must feel the texture of that experience, the daily weight of vulnerability, the constant presence of death that stalked those who could not fully participate in their society's survival strategies. The night grows deeper around you as you consider this, and perhaps you're beginning to understand why this story requires the gentle darkness of bedtime to tell. These are truths that daylight makes too harsh, realities that require the soft buffer of evening shadows to examine without being overwhelmed by their weight. So let us continue our journey together, deeper into the experience of ancient disability, deeper into understanding both the cruelty and the occasional, miraculous humanity of our ancestors. Close your eyes now, truly close them, and keep them closed as we step together into the experience of blindness in the ancient world. Feel the immediate disorientation as your primary sense disappears, leaving you dependent on sound, touch, smell, and an intuitive understanding of space that must be developed through years of careful practice. Now, imagine facing this challenge not in your familiar modern environment with its smooth sidewalks, handrails, and audio signals, but in a world of uneven stone paths, sudden drop-offs, prowling wild animals, and human settlements that change location with the seasons. You wake, perhaps, in a Neolithic dwelling, circular structure of woven branches and mud plaster, with a fire pit in the center and sleeping areas arranged around the perimeter. The air is thick with smoke that stings your useless eyes, heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies, cooked meat, and the earthy smell of the packed dirt floor. Your fingers trace the rough textures around you, woven baskets holding grain, clay pots containing precious water, the coarse wool of sleeping furs still warm from the bodies of your family members. But even as you catalogue these familiar textures, you're acutely aware of your profound vulnerability. You cannot see the expressions on faces that might warn you of anger, disapproval, or rejection. You cannot read the subtle body language that governs social interactions in a world where a single social misstep might mean exclusion from the group, and Exclusion means death. You cannot spot the predators that might approach the settlement at night, cannot see the weather patterns that determine when to plant or harvest, cannot participate in the visual cues that coordinate group hunts or migrations. Archaeological evidence suggests that prehistoric societies often practiced exposure, the abandonment of individuals deemed unable to contribute to group survival. Infants born with obvious disabilities were sometimes left outside the settlement to die of exposure, a practice that continued in various forms well into historical times. The Roman historian Plutarch wrote of Spartan customs where weak or deformed infants were examined by tribal elders and, if deemed unfit, were carried to a chasm near Mount Taygetus and left to die. For those born blind who somehow survived infancy, life became a delicate negotiation between usefulness and burden. Your existence depended entirely on the tolerance and affection of others, and that tolerance could be withdrawn at any moment. Perhaps you developed an exceptional memory, becoming a keeper of oral traditions, stories, and genealogies. Maybe you showed unusual sensitivity to sound and could serve as an early warning system for approaching storms or enemies. But these contributions were always precarious, always subject to the brutal calculus of survival during harsh times. Consider the daily challenges that would face a blind person in ancient Mesopotamia, where the first cities were rising from the fertile valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The streets were narrow, winding passages between mud brick buildings, with no standardized construction, no uniform height for doorways, no predictable placement of obstacles. Open sewers ran through the streets, creating both odorous landmarks for navigation and dangerous hazards for anyone who might stumble into them. The city would be filled with the sounds of craftsmen at work, the rhythmic hammering of metal workers, the scraping of leather being processed, the voices of merchants haggling in multiple languages, but these sounds could also mask approaching dangers. Without sight, you would be excluded from most occupations that formed the backbone of urban life. You could not work as a scribe, perhaps the most prestigious occupation available to non-nobles, because writing required precise visual coordination. You could not serve as a merchant, traveling between cities with valuable goods, because the journey would require navigating unfamiliar terrain and defending against bandits. You could not work as a craftsman, shaping clay or metal or wood into useful objects, because these skills demanded visual precision and the ability to judge quality by appearance. In ancient Egypt, where we have more detailed records of daily life, the situation was no better. The Egyptian economy depended heavily on agriculture, coordinated around the annual flooding of the Nile. Farmers needed to judge the optimal timing for planting, the quality of soil in different fields, the progress of crop growth, and the approach of harvest time, all fundamentally visual tasks. Even the river that was the lifeline of Egyptian civilization was full of dangers that required sight to navigate. Shifting sandbars, hidden rocks, crocodiles basking near the banks, and the complex system of irrigation canals that could easily disorient someone relying only on sound and touch. But perhaps most heartbreaking was the social isolation that blindness would bring in ancient times. Human beings are fundamentally social creatures, and so much of our social interaction depends on visual cues, facial expressions, posture, gestures, the subtle eye contact that establishes connection and understanding. Without sight, you would miss the warm smile that indicated acceptance, the worried glance that suggested concern, the angry expression that warned of coming conflict. You would be perpetually outside the full experience of human community, always slightly disconnected from the emotional life of the group that sustained you. The ancient world was also a place where survival often depended on rapid response to visual signals. A hand gesture indicating the approach of enemies, the sight of smoke on the horizon suggesting fire, the color of the sky that predicted weather changes. The visual assessment of whether a stranger approached with friendly or hostile intentions, all of these required immediate visual processing. That could mean the difference between life and death. As you lie there in the darkness of your modern bedroom, safely surrounded by the comforts of contemporary life, perhaps you're beginning to feel the weight of what blindness meant in ancient times. It wasn't simply a medical condition or a personal challenge to overcome. It was a fundamental disconnection from the visual web of survival that held ancient societies together. It was a constant vulnerability that made every day a negotiation with death. Every social interaction a test of others' continued willingness to support someone who could not fully reciprocate. Yet, even in this darkness, there were occasionally flickering lights of human compassion and ingenuity that we'll explore as our story continues. For now, though, let the weight of this ancient vulnerability settle around you like a heavy blanket, and prepare to journey deeper into the lived experience of disability in the unforgiving world of our ancestors. Now let us shift our attention to a different kind of isolation, equally profound but manifesting in ways that were perhaps even more socially devastating in ancient communities. Imagine losing your hearing not in our modern world of written communication, sign language, and technological accommodations, but in a time when survival depended almost entirely on spoken language, when written scripts were the jealously guarded secrets of tiny scribal elites, and when the ability to hear and respond to vocal commands could mean the difference between inclusion and exile from the only community that stood between you and death. Picture yourself in a Celtic settlement in what would later become Britain, perhaps 1500 years before the Romans arrived with their roads and their rigid organization. It's early morning, and the settlement is waking round you, but you experience this awakening in a fundamentally different way than your companions. While they are alerted by the cock's crow, the lowing of cattle, the crackling of fires being rekindled, and the voices of early risers beginning their daily tasks. You remain in a world of visual sensation and physical vibration, trying to read meaning from shadows and movement, and the subtle changes in air pressure that might indicate approaching storms or danger. The social fabric of ancient communities was woven from spoken language in ways we can barely comprehend today. Orders for the day's work were given verbally. Stories that preserved crucial cultural knowledge were passed down through oral tradition. Religious rituals depended on chanted prayers and responses. Warning calls alerted the community to approaching predators or human enemies. The complex negotiations that determined social hierarchy, marriage arrangements, trade agreements, and conflict resolution all took place through spoken words, vocal tone, and the subtle interplay of conversation. Without hearing, you would be excluded from all of these fundamental social processes. You could not participate in the evening gatherings where elders shared the stories that taught young people how to survive, where to find food in different seasons, which plants were medicinal and which were poisonous, how to read weather patterns and animal behavior. These weren't simply entertainment, they were survival manuals passed down through countless generations. And missing this crucial information could prove fatal during the first crisis you faced alone. Archaeological evidence from ancient hunter-gatherer societies suggests that successful hunts required extraordinary coordination between multiple individuals. Hunters would spread out across large areas, using vocal calls to communicate the location and movement of prey, to coordinate driving animals, to ward waiting spears or into natural traps, and to warn each other of dangers. These hunting calls were often complex systems of sound that conveyed specific information: the type of animal, its size, direction of movement, and the optimal strategy for capture. A deaf person would be completely excluded from these hunts, which were often the primary source of protein for the entire community. But the exclusion went deeper than simply missing out on one type of food gathering. In many ancient societies, successful participation in hunts was a marker of adult status, a prerequisite for marriage, and a source of social prestige that determined an individual's position within the community hierarchy. Without the ability to participate in these crucial group activities, a deaf person would remain permanently childlike in the eyes of their society, dependent on others but unable to achieve the full adult status that brought respect, authority, and the right to make decisions about communal resources. The situation was no better in the agricultural societies that gradually replaced hunter-gatherer communities across much of the world. Farming, despite our modern image of it as a solitary activity, was actually a highly coordinated social endeavor in ancient times. The timing of planting and harvesting required community-wide coordination to take advantage of optimal weather conditions and to pool labor for the intensive work periods that determined whether the community would eat or starve in the coming year. During harvest time, for example, farmers would work in coordinated groups, moving systematically across fields while maintaining constant vocal communication about weather conditions, the ripeness of crops, the location of tools, and the coordination of different tasks. Someone would call out warnings about approaching storms that could destroy unharvested grain. Others would direct the movement of draft animals or coordinate the transport of harvested grain to storage areas. The entire enterprise depended on a constant flow of auditory information that allowed dozens of people to work together efficiently during the brief window when crops were at optimal ripeness. A deaf person would be largely excluded from this crucial work, relegated perhaps to simple, repetitive tasks that could be demonstrated visually, but did not require the complex coordination that determined the community's survival. And because successful harvest work was often how individuals earned their share of the community's food stores, exclusion from harvest work could mean receiving smaller food, rations or no food at all during the lean winter months. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of deafness in ancient times was the isolation it created from human relationships. In a world without written language for the vast majority of people, romantic courtship, friendship, parent-child bonding, and all the subtle negotiations of human intimacy depended entirely on spoken communication. The shared jokes that built friendship, the whispered endearments that created romantic bonds, the bedtime stories that strengthened family connections, the quiet conversations that resolved conflicts and maintained social harmony, all of these were lost to someone who could not hear. Religious and spiritual life, which provided crucial psychological support in the face of life's constant hardships, was also built around spoken words. Prayers were recited aloud, often in community settings where the rhythm and harmony of multiple voices created a sense of unity and shared purpose. Religious festivals included communal singing, chanted responses, and spoken rituals that marked important transitions in individual and community life. The spiritual comfort that helped people endure loss, illness, and fear was largely inaccessible to those who could not hear the words that promised meaning and hope. Even more devastating was the exclusion from the early warning systems that kept communities alive. Sentries would call out warnings of approaching enemies, storms, fires, or dangerous animals. These vocal alarms could travel much farther and faster than visual signals, giving communities precious time to prepare defenses, evacuate to safety, or organize responses to threats. A deaf person might not learn of danger until it was already upon them, and their inability to hear warnings also meant they could not pass along crucial information to others. In ancient Greek society, where we have more detailed historical records, deafness was often seen as a sign of divine displeasure or moral failing. The philosopher Aristotle wrote that those born deaf were incapable of reason, a belief that justified excluding deaf individuals from citizenship, property ownership, and participation in the democratic processes that were beginning to emerge in some city-states. This philosophical framework meant that deafness was not simply a practical limitation, but a moral and intellectual disqualification from full membership in human society. The Roman legal system was similarly harsh. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code, classified deaf individuals as legally incompetent, unable to make contracts, inherit property, or participate in legal proceedings. This legal framework essentially made deaf people permanent children in the eyes of the law, dependent on guardians who controlled every aspect of their lives and could make decisions about their survival, their labor, and their fate without their consent or input. As you settle deeper into your comfortable bed, surrounded by the gentle sounds of modern life, perhaps the hum of heating systems, the distant sound of traffic, the quiet electronic beeps of devices charging nearby, imagine the profound silence that would have surrounded a deaf person in ancient times. Not the peaceful quiet of a library or bedroom, but the dangerous silence of being cut off from all the auditory information that their survival depended upon. Imagine the isolation of being surrounded by people who were constantly communicating in ways you could not access, making decisions about your life and your community's life without your participation or understanding. Yet in this darkness, as we'll discover, there were occasionally remarkable individuals who found ways to transcend these limitations, and even entire societies that developed more compassionate approaches to human difference. But for now, let the weight of this ancient silence settle around you, and prepare to explore more deeply the daily realities of disability in our ancestors' unforgiving world. As the night deepens around you and your breathing settles into the rhythm of approaching sleep, let us turn our attention to the archaeological evidence that reveals the harsh fate of disabled individuals in ancient societies. These are not comfortable stories, but they are necessary ones, silent testimonies written in bone and stone that speak across millennia about the brutal pragmatism of survival in times when human life was measured against immediate utility. Excavations across Europe, Asia, and the Americas have uncovered burial sites that tell a consistent, heartbreaking story. In many ancient cemeteries, archaeologists have found the remains of individuals with physical disabilities buried in distinctly different ways from their peers. Sometimes these graves are smaller, containing fewer grave goods, suggesting that disabled individuals held lower social status even in death. Sometimes they are located outside the main burial area, physically separated from the community even in their final rest. In a Neolithic site in what is now Germany, researchers discovered the remains of a young adult with evidence of congenital blindness. The eye sockets showed developmental abnormalities consistent with being born without sight. This individual was buried alone, nearly 100 meters from the main cemetery, with no grave goods except a simple clay vessel. The careful analysis of the bones revealed that this person had died much younger than would be expected from their physical remains, showing none of the wear patterns that typically develop over a full adult lifetime. The implication was clear. This person's life had been cut short, whether through neglect, abandonment, or active elimination. Similar patterns appear in archaeological sites across the ancient world. In Bronze Age settlements in Britain, researchers have found evidence of exposure sites areas outside settlements where unwanted individuals were left to die. These sites contain the remains of infants, elderly individuals, and those with visible disabilities, often showing evidence of having died from exposure to weather rather than violence or disease. The positioning of the remains suggests that these people were carried to these locations while still alive and then abandoned. One particularly haunting site in ancient Sparta provides archaeological confirmation of the practice described by later historians. In a chasm on Mount Tegetus, excavations have revealed hundreds of infant and child remains, many showing evidence of physical abnormalities that would have been visible at birth. The ancient sources described this as the apothetetha, place of exposure, where Spartan society disposed of children deemed unfit for their warrior culture. But to truly understand the weight of these discoveries, we must look beyond the statistics and imagine the human experience behind each set of remains. Picture a mother in ancient Mesopotamia, perhaps 4,000 years ago, holding her newborn child and slowly realizing that the infant cannot see. In our modern world, this might be the beginning of a challenging but manageable journey of adaptation and support. In her world, it was likely a death sentence that she would be expected to carry out herself. The clay tablets of ancient Babylon include legal texts that specify the obligations of parents toward children with disabilities. One particularly chilling passage states that parents who continued to feed and shelter a child who could not contribute to the household's survival were considered to be wasting resources that belonged to the entire extended family. The law granted other family members the right to intervene if they believed a disabled child was consuming too much food or requiring too much care during times of scarcity. Archaeological evidence from ancient China tells a similar story. Excavations of Han Dynasty sites have revealed burial practices that clearly distinguished between individuals based on their perceived value to society. While wealthy merchants and government officials were buried with elaborate grave goods in carefully constructed tombs, individuals with evidence of disabilities were often buried in simple pits with no artifacts, sometimes even lacking the basic grave goods that were considered necessary for the journey to the afterlife. One discovery that particularly haunts researchers is a site in ancient Egypt where archaeologists found the remains of several individuals who appear to have been blind or deaf, buried together in a mass grave outside the main necropolis. The careful analysis of their bones revealed that these individuals had lived to adulthood despite their disabilities, suggesting that they had somehow found ways to survive and contribute to their communities. Yet their burial outside the main cemetery, without the mummification and grave goods that was standard for even poor Egyptians, suggests that their contributions were never fully recognized or valued. The isotopic analysis of these remains, a technique that can reveal information about diet and geographic movement, showed that these individuals had experienced periods of malnutrition more severe than their peers, suggesting that they received smaller food rations or were fed less nutritious food throughout their lives. Even when they were allowed to live, their survival came at the cost of constant hunger and physical deprivation. Perhaps most disturbing are the sites that show evidence of ritual sacrifice involving disabled individuals. In some ancient American cultures, archaeological evidence suggests that people with physical abnormalities were sometimes selected for religious ceremonies that required human offerings. Their disabilities, rather than making them less valuable, marked them as appropriate sacrifices to the gods' expendable lives that could be offered without diminishing the community's survival capacity. One such site in pre-Columbian Mexico contains the remains of dozens of individuals. many showing evidence of blindness, deafness, or physical deformities, who appear to have been killed simultaneously in a religious ceremony. The careful positioning of the bodies and the presence of ritual artifacts suggest that these deaths were not random violence, but organized religious practices that used disabled individuals as offerings to ensure the community's prosperity. But among all these grim discoveries, there are occasionally sites that hint at different possibilities of ancient communities that found ways to care for disabled members despite the harsh realities of survival. In one Paleolithic site in Iraq, archaeologists discovered the remains of an individual who had been born with severe physical disabilities that would have made independent survival impossible. Yet the isotopic analysis of their bones showed that they had lived for several decades, receiving adequate nutrition and care throughout their life. The positioning of this burial, the center of the main cemetery, surrounded by grave goods that indicated respect and affection, suggested that this individual had been valued by their community despite their inability to contribute in traditional ways. Perhaps they had served as a keeper of oral traditions, a source of spiritual guidance, or simply as a beloved member of the community whose presence enriched the lives of others in ways that transcended immediate survival needs. These exceptional cases provide glimpses of the human capacity for compassion even in the harshest circumstances. But they also highlight how rare such compassion was in the ancient world. For every disabled individual who was cared for and valued, there were dozens whose remains tell stories of abandonment, neglect, and early death. As you lie in your comfortable bed, surrounded by the safety and support systems of modern life, consider the weight of these archaeological testimonies. Each set of remains represents not just a statistical data point, but a human life that was deemed expendable. A person whose dreams, fears, loves, and hopes were cut short by societies that could not see beyond immediate survival needs. The silence of these ancient graves speaks volumes about both the harshness of human history and the precious value of the compassion and accommodation that we sometimes take for granted in our modern world. Yet, as we'll discover in the chapters ahead, even in these dark times, there were individuals who somehow transcended their limitations and societies that occasionally chose mercy over pragmatism. But for now, let these archaeological truths settle around you like a gentle weight, reminding you of how far humanity has traveled from those ancient shores of survival, and how fragile and precious our modern understanding of human dignity truly is. In the gentle darkness of your bedroom, as the weight of archaeological evidence settles around you like a heavy blanket, let us now turn our attention to the individual human stories that occasionally pierce through the statistical gloom of ancient disability. These are not the sanitized tales of inspiration that we might prefer to hear, but the raw, complicated, and often heartbreaking stories of real people who somehow found ways to survive in societies that had little room for their existence. Imagine, if you will, a young woman named Keret living in ancient Canaan, perhaps 3,000 years ago, during the time when the great trading cities of the eastern Mediterranean were at their height. Born blind into a family of pottery makers, Keret represented both a tragedy and a potential catastrophe for her parents. The pottery trade required precise visual skills, judging the consistency of clay, monitoring the color changes during firing, decorating vessels with the intricate patterns that distinguished one family's work from another's. A blind daughter could not continue the family trade, could not contribute to the household's income, and would require care and feeding without offering economic return. Yet somehow, Keret survived childhood. Perhaps it was her mother's stubborn love, or her father's reluctant recognition that abandoning her would bring shame from neighbors who knew the family. Perhaps it was the gradual discovery that Carrot's hands, deprived of visual guidance, had developed an extraordinary sensitivity to texture and form. While she could not see the clay as it took shape on the potter's wheel, her fingers could detect subtle inconsistencies in wall thickness that escaped her sighted family members. Her palms could sense temperature variations in the kiln that helped determine optimal firing times. Archaeological evidence from pottery workshops in ancient Canaan suggests that some disabled individuals did find niches within craft production, though always in subordinate roles and likely receiving smaller shares of the profits. Carrot might have spent her days preparing claniding out air bubbles, mixing different grades of earth to achieve optimal consistency, or performing the repetitive tasks that required patience and precision but not sight. Her survival would have depended entirely on her family's continued tolerance and her ability to make herself useful enough to justify the food she consumed. But usefulness in ancient times was always precarious. During years of poor harvest or economic disruption, when every grain of wheat was precious and every mouth to feed represented a drain on limited resources, even a productive disabled person could become expendable. Carrot would have lived always on the edge of abandonment, her survival dependent not just on her own skills but on forces entirely beyond her control: the health of her parents, the prosperity of the pottery trade, the political stability that allowed commercial activity to flourish. Now picture a different story unfolding in ancient Egypt. Along the banks of the Nile, where papyrus grew thick in the marshy areas near the Great River, here lived a boy named Hetty, who had lost his hearing to fever when he was 7 years old, just at the age when most children began learning the complex skills that would determine their adult occupations. In Egypt's hierarchical society, opportunities for advancement depended heavily on literacy and the ability to participate in the elaborate bureaucracy that governed everything from tax collection to military service. Hetty's deafness excluded him from the scribal schools where promising young men learned to read and write hieroglyphics, the skill that could elevate a person from peasant status to positions of authority and respect. He could not serve in the army, where success required the ability to hear and respond instantly to shouted commands during battle. He could not work in the complex irrigation systems that made Egyptian agriculture possible, where coordinating the opening and closing of canal gates required precise timing communicated through vocal signals. Yet Hetty found a different path to survival, one that reveals both the harsh pragmatism and occasional ingenuity of ancient societies. The papyrus marshes where he lived were dangerous places, filled with crocodiles, hippos, and venomous snakes that could kill an unwary person in moments. But they were also rich sources of valuable materials: papyrus for writing, fish for food, water birds whose feathers were prized for decoration and religious ceremonies. Hetty's deafness, ironically, became an asset in this environment. While hearing people were constantly distracted by the sounds of wind, bird calls, and water movement, Hetty focused entirely on visual information. He became extraordinarily skilled at reading the subtle visual signs that indicated the presence of dangerous animals. The barely perceptible ripples that suggested a crocodile moving through water, the disturbance of reeds that warned of a hippo's approach, the shadow patterns that revealed snakes hiding in vegetation. Egyptian papyrus texts from this period mention individuals called marsh watchers, people who specialized in guiding others safely through the dangerous wetlands. These guides were highly valued because their expertise could mean the difference between a successful fishing expedition and a deadly encounter with Nile predators. Hetty might have found his place in society by becoming such a guide. using his visual acuity and intimate knowledge of marsh dangers to keep others safe while they gathered the valuable resources that the wetlands provided. But even this specialized role came with constant vulnerability. Marsh watching was dangerous work, and accidents were common. A moment's inattention, a misreading of animal behavior, or simply bad luck could result in death or serious injury. Moreover, Hetty's survival depended on maintaining his reputation for reliability and expertise. A single mistake that led to someone's injury or death could destroy the trust that allowed him to continue working, leaving him with no other viable way to support himself. Travel now, in your imagination, to ancient Greece during the classical period, perhaps to Athens during its golden age of philosophy and democracy. Here we encounter a different kind of story, that of a young man named Alexios, who was born deaf into a family of moderate wealth and education. In Greek society, physical perfection was highly valued, and disability was often seen as a sign of divine displeasure or moral failing. Yet Athens was also a place where intellectual achievement was beginning to be valued alongside physical prowess, creating new possibilities for those who could not participate in traditional roles. Alexios could not participate in the oral debates that were the foundation of Athenian democracy, could not serve in the military where coordination and communication were essential for survival, and could not engage in the social interactions that determined business partnerships and political alliances. But he lived during a time when written language was becoming more common, when philosophical ideas were beginning to be recorded in texts rather than transmitted only through oral teaching. Archaeological evidence suggests that some wealthy Greek families found ways to educate disabled children privately, hiring tutors who could work with individuals who could not participate in traditional educational settings. Alexios might have learned to read and write, to understand mathematical concepts, and to engage with philosophical ideas through written texts rather than spoken lectures. His family's wealth could have provided him with scrolls, writing materials, and the leisure time necessary for scholarly pursuits. Yet even this privileged position came with profound limitations. Greek society was fundamentally social and political, built around participation in public life that required oral communication. Alexios could read the philosophical works of Plato or Aristotle, but he could not participate in the dialogues and debates that were central to Greek intellectual life. He could understand democratic theory, but he could not vote or speak in the assembly. His education, however extensive, could not overcome the social barriers that his deafness created. These individual stories, drawn from archaeological evidence and historical records, reveal the complex ways that disabled individuals navigated ancient societies. Their survival often depended on finding specialized niches where their limitations were less relevant and their remaining abilities could be valued. But these niches were always precarious, always dependent on factors beyond their control, and always shadowed by the possibility of abandonment or death. What emerges from these stories is not the inspiring narrative of triumph over adversity that we might prefer, but a more complicated picture of human adaptability and resilience operating within systems that were fundamentally hostile to difference. These individuals survived not because their societies were compassionate or inclusive, but because they found ways to make themselves useful enough to justify their continued existence in communities that viewed human worth primarily through the lens of immediate survival value. As you drift towards sleep, consider the weight of these individual lives, the daily negotiations with survival, the constant awareness of vulnerability, the small victories and devastating setbacks that marked their passage through a world that offered them no guarantees except the certainty that their existence would always be conditional, always dependent on their ability to prove their worth to others who held the power of life and death over them. Yet in their stories, we also catch glimpses of human ingenuity and determination that somehow persisted even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. These were not passive victims, but active agents of their own survival. Individuals who found ways to carve out meaning and purpose in a world that seemed designed to exclude them. Their legacy reminds us that the human spirit, even under the most crushing circumstances, sometimes finds ways to endure and even flourish. As the darkness deepens around you and your body settles more fully into rest, let us explore those rare but precious moments in ancient history when societies chose a different path, when communities found ways to care for their disabled members despite the harsh mathematics of survival. These stories shine like distant stars in the darkness of our historical narrative, offering glimpses of human compassion that transcended immediate self-interest and pointed toward possibilities that most ancient peoples could not imagine. In the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a Paleolithic community that existed roughly 40,000 years ago, a time when human survival depended entirely on hunting, gathering, and the most basic forms of tool-making. Among the remains discovered at this site was the skeleton of an individual who had been born with severe physical disabilities that would have made independent survival absolutely impossible. The person's limbs showed developmental abnormalities. Their spine was curved in ways that would have prevented walking, and their skull showed signs of cognitive impairment. Yet the isotopic analysis of this individual's bones told a remarkable story. They had lived for nearly 4 decades, receiving adequate nutrition throughout their life and showing none of the signs of neglect or abuse that marked so many disabled individuals in the archaeological record. More striking still, the wear patterns on their teeth and the chemical signatures in their bones indicated that they had eaten the same high-quality foods as other community members, including meat from successful hunts that they could never have participated in. This discovery challenges our assumptions about prehistoric societies and their treatment of disabled members. Here was a community that chose to allocate precious resources to caring for someone who could contribute nothing to their immediate survival needs. For 40 years, other members of this small band shared their food, provided protection, and carried this individual when the group moved to follow seasonal migrations of game animals. The decision to provide this care was renewed daily for nearly 15,000 days. Through countless moments when resources were scarce and survival was uncertain. What motivated this extraordinary commitment? We can only speculate. But the evidence suggests that this individual served some role that the community valued beyond immediate economic utility. Perhaps they were a keeper of crucial knowledge, memorizing the locations of water sources, the seasonal patterns of animal migration, or the complex genealogies that determined social relationships within the group. Maybe they possessed some form of spiritual authority, serving as a connection to the supernatural forces that prehistoric peoples believed governed their world. Or perhaps on this possibility is both the most hopeful and the most radical. This community simply chose compassion for its own sake, recognizing some fundamental human worth that transcended immediate survival needs. If so, they were thousands of years ahead of their time in developing ethical frameworks that most human societies would not embrace until the modern era. Similar evidence appears at other archaeological sites around the world, though always as remarkable exceptions rather than common practices. In ancient Israel, during the time of the biblical kingdoms, archaeologists have found burial sites that suggest some disabled individuals achieved positions of respect and authority within their communities. One tomb, dating to the 8th century BCE, contained the remains of a person who had been blind from birth, yet was buried with expensive grave goods and in a location reserved for community leaders. The Hebrew scriptures from this period contain laws that seem designed to protect disabled individuals from abandonment or abuse. The Book of Leviticus includes passages that specifically forbid placing obstacles in the path of blind people or cursing deaf individuals, suggesting that such practices were common enough to require explicit prohibition. More remarkably, these laws frame such protections not as acts of charity but as religious obligations, suggesting that caring for disabled community members was seen as a divine commandment rather than simply a social nicety. Archaeological evidence from ancient Egyptian sites tells a more complex story of a society that developed sophisticated medical knowledge and occasionally applied it to help disabled individuals. Egyptian papyrus texts describe surgical procedures for treating cataracts, methods for managing epilepsy, and prosthetic devices for people who had lost limbs. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, includes detailed descriptions of treatments for spinal injuries that might prevent or reduce paralysis. More intriguingly, some Egyptian tomb paintings depict individuals with obvious disabilities, participating in religious ceremonies and court functions. One particularly famous painting from the tomb of a high official shows a blind harpist performing at a banquet, suggesting that some disabled individuals found niches within Egyptian society where their remaining abilities were valued and celebrated. The harpist is depicted not as a pitiful figure deserving charity, but as a skilled professional contributing to the cultural life of the elite. However, we must be careful not to romanticize these examples. Even in societies that showed unusual compassion toward disabled individuals, such care was typically limited to those from wealthy families or those who possessed unusual talents that made them valuable despite their disabilities. The vast majority of disabled people in ancient Egypt, like their counterparts elsewhere, probably faced abandonment, neglect, or early death. In ancient China, Confucian philosophy developed ethical frameworks that emphasized social harmony and mutual obligation in ways that sometimes extended protection to vulnerable individuals. The Analects of Confucius include passages that suggest rulers had obligations to care for those who could not care for themselves, though these obligations were framed in terms of social stability rather than individual rights. Archaeological evidence from Han Dynasty sites shows that some disabled individuals were incorporated into imperial bureaucracies, particularly in roles that required specialized skills like music, astronomy, or record-keeping. Chinese historical texts mention blind scholars who memorized vast quantities of classical literature, deaf craftsmen who created intricate works of art, and disabled individuals who served as advisors to emperors because their exclusion from normal social networks made them trustworthy confidants. Yet even these relatively progressive approaches came with significant limitations. The Chinese system of care for disabled individuals was highly hierarchical and paternalistic, treating them as objects of benevolent concern rather than as individuals with agency and dignity. Moreover, such care was available only to those who could demonstrate exceptional abilities or who had powerful patrons willing to support them. Perhaps the most systematic approach to caring for disabled individuals in the ancient world emerged in the early Christian communities of the Roman Empire. The Christian emphasis on the inherent dignity of all human souls, regardless of physical or intellectual capacity, represented a radical departure from the utilitarian values that dominated classical antiquity. Archaeological evidence from early Christian sites shows burial practices that treated disabled individuals with the same respect accorded to other community members. Christian catacombs contain the remains of blind, deaf, and physically disabled individuals buried alongside bishops and wealthy donors, with identical grave goods and similar inscription styles. This egalitarian treatment in death suggests that Christian communities extended similar equality to disabled members during their lifetimes. Early Christian texts describe organized systems of care for disabled individuals that went far beyond what other ancient societies provided. The Didache, one of the earliest Christian instructional texts, includes specific provisions for supporting blind and deaf community members, not as acts of charity, but as expressions of religious faith. Christian communities established what were essentially the world's first organized disability support systems, pooling resources to ensure that disabled members received adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Yet even within Christian communities, the reality often fell short of the ideal. Many early Christian writers still viewed disability as a form of divine punishment or a test of faith. Attitudes that could lead to spiritual pressure on disabled individuals to demonstrate exceptional piety or to seek miraculous healing. The emphasis on miraculous cures, while offering hope, also implied that disability was a problem to be solved, rather than a natural variation in human experience. Moreover, Christian care for disabled individuals was often motivated by beliefs about spiritual reward rather than recognition of inherent human dignity. Disabled people were sometimes treated as opportunities for others to demonstrate Christian virtue, a dynamic that could be dehumanizing even when it resulted in material support. As you lie in the gentle darkness, considering these scattered examples of ancient compassion, you might feel a complex mix of emotions. These stories offer hope by demonstrating that human societies have sometimes chosen mercy over expedience, that even in the harshest circumstances, some communities found ways to value human life beyond its immediate utility. Yet they also highlight how rare and fragile such compassion was, how dependent it remained on specific cultural, economic, or religious circumstances that could change without warning. The archaeological record makes clear that for every disabled individual who received care and support, there were dozens who faced abandonment, neglect, or early death. The societies that chose compassion were remarkable precisely because they were so unusual, swimming against the powerful current of survival-based thinking that dominated most of human history. Yet these examples planted seeds that would eventually grow into our modern understanding of human rights and dignity. The recognition that human worth transcends immediate utility, that societies have obligations to care for their most vulnerable members, and that diversity of ability can enrich rather than burden communities. These ideas first appeared in these ancient experiments with compassion, even if they would take millennia to fully develop. As your breathing slows and your body settles toward sleep, let these stories of ancient mercy wrap around you like a gentle blanket. They remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, there were always some individuals and communities willing to choose love over logic, compassion over calculation, and hope over despair. Their legacy lives on in our modern commitment to disability rights and inclusion, a testament to the slow but persistent growth of human moral imagination across the centuries. In the deepening quiet of your evening rest, as your mind begins to drift between wakefulness and sleep, let us explore one of the most profound ways that ancient societies marked the boundaries between belonging and exclusion through the rituals, ceremonies, and religious practices that either welcomed disabled individuals into full community membership or formally cast them out into the dangerous margins of social existence. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a Bronze Age settlement in what would later become Denmark. Perhaps 3,000 years ago, During the time when complex religious ceremonies were beginning to emerge alongside the development of organized agriculture and metalworking. The air is thick with smoke from sacred fires, heavy with the scent of burning herbs and the metallic temps of bronze implements being used in ritual activities. Around you, the entire community has gathered for one of the most important ceremonies of their religious calendar, the rites that would determine which children born during the past year would be accepted as full members of the tribe. The archaeological record from this period reveals evidence of elaborate ritual sites where communities gathered to make collective decisions about inclusion and exclusion. These weren't simple, pragmatic choices about resource allocation, but complex religious ceremonies that invested the community's decisions with sacred authority and divine approval. The exclusion of disabled individuals wasn't presented as a harsh necessity, but as obedience to divine will, making resistance or questioning much more difficult. In these ancient communities, you would witness ceremonies that modern sensibilities find almost unbearable to contemplate. Children who had survived their first year of life were brought before the assembled community and examined by religious leaders, who claimed the ability to read divine will in physical signs and omens. A child born blind might be declared cursed by the gods, their disability interpreted as evidence of divine displeasure with the family or the community as a whole. Archaeological evidence suggests that these religious determinations carried enormous weight because they offered psychological comfort to communities making what were essentially life and death decisions about resource allocation. By framing the abandonment or killing of disabled children as religious duty rather than economic necessity, these ceremonies allowed people to maintain their sense of moral righteousness while eliminating individuals who would strain the community's survival capacity. But the rituals served another, perhaps even more important function. They created psychological distance between the community and those they were choosing to exclude. By declaring disabled individuals to be spiritually different, marked by the gods, or belonging to a separate category of being, these ceremonies made it easier for people to abandon them without feeling that they were abandoning fellow humans. The Roman historian Tacitus described similar practices among the Germanic tribes he encountered during his military campaigns. He wrote of ceremonies where infants with visible disabilities were brought to sacred groves and subjected to ritual tests that supposedly revealed divine will about their fate. Those deemed acceptable to the gods were welcomed into the tribe with elaborate celebrations. Those judged unfavorable were left in the forest, their abandonment sanctified by religious authority. Yet these same ritual systems occasionally produced surprising outcomes that reveal the complex ways ancient peoples understood disability and divine will. Archaeological sites sometimes contain evidence of disabled individuals who not only survived these religious examinations, but were actually elevated to positions of spiritual authority within their communities. In ancient Celtic societies, for example, there is evidence that some individuals born with certain types of disabilities were considered to possess special connections to the other world. Blind children, rather than being abandoned, were sometimes selected for training as druids, the priestly class that maintained oral traditions, performed religious ceremonies, and served as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. The logic behind this practice reveals fascinating assumptions about the relationship between physical and spiritual perception. Celtic religious thought suggested that the loss of physical sight might enhance spiritual vision, that blindness in the material world could correspond to enhanced perception of supernatural realities. Archaeological evidence from Celtic ritual sites includes specialized burial practices for blind individuals that suggest They held positions of religious authority and social respect. One particularly intriguing discovery comes from an Iron Age site in Ireland, where archaeologists found the remains of a person who had been blind from birth, buried in the center of a stone circle with elaborate grave goods that indicated high social status. The positioning of this burial, at the heart of what was clearly a sacred site, suggests that this individual's blindness was not seen as a disability, but as a qualification for spiritual leadership. Similar patterns appear in other ancient cultures around the world. Among some Native American tribes, archaeological evidence suggests that individuals with certain disabilities were considered to possess medicine power, spiritual abilities that made them valuable as healers, visionaries, and guides in religious ceremonies. Rather than being excluded from sacred rituals, these individuals were central to them, their disabilities reinterpreted as signs of divine favor rather than divine displeasure. The ancient Greek concept of the oracle provides another example of how disability could sometimes be transformed from curse to blessing through religious interpretation. Many of the famous oracles of the ancient world were women who displayed what we might now recognize as symptoms of mental illness or neurological conditions, behaviors that contemporary medicine would classify as pathological but that ancient Greek religious thought interpreted as divine possession. The oracle at Delphi, perhaps the most famous religious authority in the ancient Mediterranean world, was typically a woman who experienced what classical sources describe as seizures, visions, and altered states of consciousness during her prophetic sessions. Rather than being excluded from religious life because of these symptoms, she was elevated to the highest position of spiritual authority, consulted by kings and emperors who believed her disabilities were actually signs of divine connection. Yet we must be careful not to romanticize these examples of religious inclusion. Even when disabled individuals were incorporated into religious systems, they were often subjected to forms of exploitation and control that were deeply dehumanizing. The Celtic Druids, who were selected because of their blindness, for instance, underwent training processes that could last decades and that completely severed their connections to family and normal social relationships. The Greek oracles, despite their prestigious positions, were essentially prisoners of the religious establishments that controlled them. They lived under strict regulations, were forbidden to marry or have children, and were expected to be available for consultation at any time, regardless of their personal needs or desires. Their disabilities made them valuable to their societies, but it also made them vulnerable to forms of exploitation that would have been unthinkable for non-disabled individuals. Archaeological evidence from temple sites across the ancient world reveals the complex ways that religious institutions both included and controlled disabled individuals. Many temples contained specialized living quarters for disabled religious personnel, but these quarters were often isolated from the main temple complex and designed more like prisons than residences. The inclusion came with a price to complete surrender of personal autonomy and individual identity. Moreover, the religious interpretation of disability as divine sign or spiritual gift was highly selective and often arbitrary. A blind child might be elevated to religious authority, while a deaf child from the same family might be abandoned to die. The same physical condition could be interpreted as divine favor in one context and divine curse in another, depending on political needs, resource availability, and the whims of religious authorities. The Roman Empire developed perhaps the most systematic approach to using religious rituals to manage disabled populations. Roman religious law included elaborate ceremonies for determining the fate of disabled individuals, with different procedures for different types of disabilities and different social classes. Wealthy families could often secure favorable religious interpretations for their disabled children through donations to temples and payments to religious officials, while poor families had no such options. Archaeological evidence from Roman sites shows that disabled individuals who were incorporated into religious institutions often lived longer than their peers, but in conditions of strict control and limited freedom. They were fed adequately and protected from violence, but they were also subjected to religious discipline that regulated every aspect of their daily lives. As you settle deeper into the comfort of your modern bed, surrounded by the safety and freedom that contemporary life provides, consider the weight of these ancient religious practices. The rituals that determined inclusion or exclusion, belonging or abandonment, were not merely practical decisions about resource allocation, but profound statements about the nature of humanity and divine will. These ceremonies created the psychological and spiritual frameworks that allowed entire communities to participate in decisions that we would now consider morally unthinkable. By investing exclusion with sacred authority, ancient societies made it possible for individuals to abandon disabled family members, neighbors, and community members while maintaining their sense of righteousness and moral worth. Yet these same religious systems also occasionally produced moments of remarkable inclusion and recognition, elevating disabled individuals to positions of authority and respect that transcended their physical limitations. The complexity of these ancient responses to disability reveals the profound ways that religious belief shaped human relationships and community belonging, for better and for worse. As your consciousness begins to drift towards sleep, let these stories of ancient rituals settle around you like whispered prayers, reminding you of both the darkness and the light that have always existed within human communities, and of the slow, difficult progress we have made toward recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of all human beings, regardless of ability or difference. As the final hours of night embrace you and your journey toward sleep becomes almost complete, let us conclude our exploration with reflections on the slow, difficult emergence of more compassionate understandings of disability, the gradual dawn of recognition that human worth transcends immediate utility, and that communities are enriched rather than burdened by their most vulnerable members. The transformation didn't happen quickly or easily. For thousands of years after the development of agriculture, urbanization, and complex societies, most human communities continued to view disabled individuals through the harsh lens of survival necessity. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, new ideas began to emerge, philosophical frameworks that questioned the automatic equation of physical ability with human value, religious teachings that emphasized the spiritual dignity of all people, and practical innovations that made it easier for disabled individuals to contribute to their communities. Picture yourself in ancient Athens during the 5th century BCE, walking through the agora, where philosophers gathered to debate fundamental questions about human nature, justice, and the good life. Here, among the marble columns and olive trees, you might have encountered some of the first systematic challenges to traditional attitudes toward disability. The philosopher Plato, despite his own prejudices and limitations, wrote passages in the Republic that questioned whether physical perfection was truly necessary for intellectual and moral excellence. Even more remarkably, some ancient Greek thinkers began to suggest that disability might actually enhance certain forms of human understanding. The poet Homer, himself possibly blind, created literary works that celebrated the wisdom that could emerge from suffering and limitation. The tradition of the blind bard, the storyteller whose lack of physical sight somehow enhanced their spiritual vision and artistic insight, began to challenge simple equations between physical ability and human worth. Archaeological evidence from later Greek and Roman sites shows Gradual changes in burial practices that suggest slowly evolving attitudes toward disabled individuals, while earlier periods showed clear discrimination in grave goods and burial locations. Later sites increasingly showed disabled individuals buried with the same respect accorded to other community members. This archaeological shift suggests that philosophical and religious changes were beginning to influence popular attitudes and practices. The emergence of Christianity represented a particularly significant turning point in Western attitudes toward disability. The Christian emphasis on the inherent dignity of all souls, regardless of physical condition, provided a theological foundation for caring for disabled individuals that went far beyond the utilitarian calculations that had dominated earlier societies. Early Christian communities developed organized systems of support that represented the world's first systematic attempts at what we might now call disability services. But the Christian transformation was neither immediate nor complete. Many early Christian writers continued to view disability as the result of sin or as a divine test, attitudes that could be just as harmful as outright abandonment. The emphasis on miraculous healing, while offering hope, also suggested that disability was a problem to be solved rather than a natural variation in human experience. Moreover, Christian care for disabled individuals was often motivated by beliefs about spiritual reward rather than recognition of inherent human dignity. Disabled people were sometimes treated as opportunities for others to demonstrate Christian virtue, a dynamic that could be dehumanizing even when it resulted in material support. The medieval period saw the development of the first institutions, specifically designed to care for disabled individuals, monasteries and hospitals that provided food, shelter, and basic medical care to those who could not care for themselves. These institutions represented a significant advance over the abandonment and neglect that had characterized earlier periods. But they also reflected assumptions about disabled individuals that were deeply paternalistic and controlling. Archaeological excavations of medieval hospitals and monasteries reveal living conditions that were often harsh and restrictive, with disabled residents subjected to strict rules and constant supervision. These institutions provided survival, but at the cost of personal freedom and individual autonomy. The care they offered was real and often life-saving, but it came wrapped in assumptions about dependence and incapacity that would persist for centuries. The Renaissance and Enlightenment periods brought new philosophical frameworks that began to challenge traditional assumptions about human nature and social organization. Thinkers like John Locke and Immanuel Kant developed theories of human dignity and individual rights that, while not explicitly addressing disability, provided intellectual foundations for more inclusive approaches to human difference. The development of more sophisticated medical knowledge during these periods also began to change how societies understood and responded to disability. Conditions that had previously been attributed to divine will or moral failing were increasingly understood as medical conditions that might be treated or managed. This medicalization of disability was a double-edged development. It reduced stigma and superstition, but also created new forms of professional control and institutional management. Archaeological evidence from early modern European sites shows continuing evolution in attitudes toward disabled individuals. Burial practices became increasingly egalitarian, and there is evidence of growing investment in prosthetic devices, mobility aids, and other technologies designed to help disabled individuals participate more fully in community life. The Industrial Revolution brought both opportunities and new challenges for disabled individuals. On one hand, the development of industrial technology created new possibilities for employment that didn't depend on traditional physical abilities. On the other hand, the pace and dangerous conditions of industrial work created new forms of disability and new populations of people who needed support and accommodation. The archaeological record from industrial sites reveals the harsh realities of factory work for disabled individuals. Evidence of workplace injuries, inadequate safety equipment, and living conditions that were often little better than medieval institutions. Yet there is also evidence of growing organization among disabled workers. Early labor movements that began to advocate for safer working conditions and compensation for workplace injuries. The 20th century brought unprecedented changes in attitudes toward disability, driven by 2 world wars that created large populations of disabled veterans who could not be easily dismissed or abandoned. The development of modern medicine, rehabilitation techniques, and assistive technologies made it possible for disabled individuals to participate in society in ways that had never before been possible. Perhaps most importantly, disabled individuals themselves began to organize and advocate for their own rights and dignity. The disability rights movement challenged paternalistic assumptions about dependence and incapacity, demanding recognition as full citizens with the same rights and opportunities as their non-disabled peers. The archaeological record of the modern period, if we can call it, that includes evidence of this transformation in the form of accessibility modifications to public buildings, the development of assistive technologies, and changes in institutional design that reflect new understandings of human dignity and civil rights. Yet even in our contemporary world, the legacy of ancient attitudes toward disability persists in subtle and not so subtle ways. We still struggle with assumptions about productivity and worth, still face temptations to measure human value by economic contribution, still grapple with fears about resource allocation and social burden that echo the survival anxieties of our ancient ancestors. The journey from the harsh pragmatism of ancient societies to our modern commitment to disability rights and inclusion has been long, difficult, and far from complete. But it represents one of the most remarkable transformations in human moral imagination. The gradual recognition that human worth transcends immediate utility, that communities are enriched by diversity, and that caring for our most vulnerable members is not a burden but an expression of our highest values. As you settle into the final moments before sleep, surrounded by the comfort and safety of modern life, perhaps you can feel grateful for the long journey that brought us from those ancient shores of survival to our contemporary understanding of human dignity. The disabled individuals who were abandoned in ancient times, whose stories we've explored together tonight, did not die in vain if their suffering helps us appreciate the precious value of the compassion and inclusion that we sometimes take for granted. Their legacy lives on in every wheelchair ramp, every sign language interpreter, every assistive technology, and every act of accommodation that makes it possible for disabled individuals to participate fully in community life. Their memory calls us to continue the work of building more inclusive societies, to resist the temptation to return to utilitarian calculations of human worth, and to remember that our humanity is measured not by our individual abilities, but by our collective commitment to caring for one another. Rest now, knowing that you are part of this great transformation, this slow dawn of understanding that has been millennia in the making. Sleep peacefully, surrounded by the knowledge that human compassion, however fragile and imperfect, has proven stronger than the harsh logic of survival that once governed our species. And wake tomorrow ready to continue the work of building a world worthy of the dignity that resides in every human soul, regardless of ability or difference. And so, dear listener, as the deepest hours of night embrace you and this long journey through human history draws to its close, We find ourselves returned to where we began, to the gentle darkness of your bedroom, to the soft refuge of your comfortable bed, to the precious safety of a world that has learned, slowly and imperfectly, to value human life beyond its immediate utility. You have traveled with me tonight through some of the darkest chapters of our shared human story, witnessing the harsh realities faced by disabled individuals in ancient times, exploring the brutal calculations that once determined who would live and who would die, and discovering both the cruelty and the occasional compassion of our ancestors. It has not been an easy journey, but it has been a necessary one, a reminder of how far we have come and how fragile our progress truly is. Perhaps as you've listened to these stories, you've felt a complex mixture of emotions: horror at the treatment disabled individuals faced in ancient times, sadness for the countless lives lost to societies that could not see beyond immediate survival needs, anger at the waste of human potential, the silencing of voices that might have contributed so much to their communities if only they had been given the chance. But perhaps also gratitude, profound gratitude for the world we inhabit today, imperfect as it may be. The journey from ancient abandonment to modern inclusion has been neither straight nor swift. It has taken thousands of years, countless individual acts of courage and compassion, and the gradual expansion of human moral imagination to reach our current understanding that every human life has inherent dignity and worth. This transformation represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, though it remains incomplete and constantly threatened by the same survival anxieties that governed our ancient ancestors. When you wake tomorrow morning and navigate your familiar world, whether you yourself live with a disability or move through life with abilities, you may take for granted, remember, that every accommodation, every accessibility feature, every act of inclusion represents a victory over the harsh logic that once condemned disabled individuals to abandonment or death. The wheelchair ramps and audio signals, the sign language interpreters and assistive technologies, the laws that protect against discrimination and the social movements that advocate for inclusion, all of these are monuments to human progress, testimonies to our species' slow but persistent growth in wisdom and compassion. But remember, too, that this progress is not inevitable or irreversible. In times of crisis, resource scarcity, or social stress, the ancient temptations return their impulse to measure human worth by economic productivity, to view disabled individuals as burdens rather than full community members, to make decisions based on utilitarian calculations rather than principles of human dignity. The stories we've explored tonight serve as warnings as much as historical accounts, reminders of what humanity is capable of when fear and desperation override compassion and moral imagination. The disabled individuals whose stories we've encountered, from the abandoned infants of prehistoric settlements to the excluded deaf and blind individuals of ancient civilizations, did not suffer in vain if their experiences help us understand the precious value of the inclusion and accommodation we sometimes take for granted. Their memory calls us to continued vigilance, to ongoing advocacy, and to the daily work of building more inclusive communities. Each time we choose patience over frustration when communicating with someone who processes information differently, each time we advocate for accessibility improvements that benefit not just disabled individuals but entire communities, each time we resist the temptation to measure human worth by productivity or economic contribution, we honor the memory of those ancient souls who were denied the chance to live, contribute, and flourish in their own communities. The archaeological evidence we've examined tonight, the differential burial practices, the signs of abandonment and neglect, the rare examples of care and inclusionary minds, us that human societies have always faced choices about how to treat their most vulnerable members. These choices reveal the deepest values and commitments of civilizations. The principles that guide communities when resources are scarce and survival is uncertain. Our contemporary commitment to disability rights and inclusion represents a choice to value human dignity over immediate utility. To measure community strength by how well we care for our most vulnerable members, rather than by the productivity of our most capable individuals. This choice is not easy or natural. It requires constant effort, ongoing resources, and the willingness to prioritize long-term moral development over short-term economic efficiency. But the choice is also deeply rewarding, both for individuals and for society as a whole. Communities that embrace disability inclusion discover reserves of creativity, resilience, and wisdom that would otherwise remain untapped. They learn that accommodation benefits everyone, that diversity strengthens rather than weakens social bonds, and that the act of caring for others is itself a form of human flourishing that enriches the lives of caregivers as much as care recipients. As you settle into these final moments before sleep, let yourself feel the weight of this historical journey we've shared. But let yourself also feel the lightness that comes from recognizing how far humanity has traveled from those ancient shores of survival. You live in a time when disabled individuals can serve as leaders, innovators, artists, and advocates, when assistive technologies can overcome barriers that once seemed insurmountable, and when legal and social frameworks increasingly recognize the full humanity and dignity of all people. This is not to say that our work is complete, far from it. Discrimination, exclusion, and neglect still exist in forms both subtle and overt. Many disabled individuals continue to face barriers to full participation in education, employment, and community life. The promise of inclusion remains unevenly fulfilled, and the temptation to retreat to utilitarian calculations of human worth persists, especially during times of economic or social stress. But the direction of change is clear, and the momentum toward greater inclusion and recognition continues to build. Each generation seems to understand a little more clearly that human diversity is a source of strength rather than weakness, that accommodation enriches rather than burdens communities, and that the measure of a civilization lies not in the achievements of its most capable members, but in how well it cares for those who need the most support. As the night deepens around you and your consciousness drifts between the waking world and the realm of dreams, let us return once more to the ancient world to explore one of the most remarkable aspects of disability in early human societies: the secret languages, hidden communication systems, and ingenious adaptations that some disabled individuals developed to navigate their harsh environments. Picture yourself in a Mayan city-state during the classical period, perhaps around 600 CE, when the great pyramid temples rose like stone mountains from the jungle floor and the sophisticated calendar systems tracked celestial movements with mathematical precision that would not be equaled in Europe for another 1,000 years. The air is thick with humidity, and the calls of howler monkeys, heavy with the scent of copal incense burning in temple ceremonies, and the earthy smell of recently turned soil in the agricultural terraces that fed the city's population. In this complex, urban environment, you encounter a young man named Itzel, who lost his hearing during childhood to one of the periodic disease outbreaks that swept through Mesoamerican cities. By the harsh logic that governed most ancient societies, Itzel should have been abandoned or relegated to the most marginal existence possible. Yet archaeological evidence from Mayan sites suggests that some deaf individuals not only survived but developed remarkable communication systems. that allowed them to participate in their communities in ways that would have been impossible without their creative adaptations. Itzhak discovered that the visual nature of Mayan hieroglyphic writing, combined with the elaborate hand gestures that accompanied formal religious and political ceremonies, created opportunities for communication that didn't depend on hearing. While he could not participate in the spoken chants that marked religious festivals, he became extraordinarily skilled at reading the subtle visual cues that governed Mayan social interactions, the positioning of bodies during ceremonial gatherings, the colors and patterns of textile designs that indicated social status, the architectural arrangements that communicated political relationships between different noble families. More remarkably, archaeological evidence suggests that some Mayan communities developed rudimentary sign language systems, possibly created by and for deaf individuals who needed to communicate complex information without relying on spoken words. Stone carvings from several Mayan sites depict individuals making elaborate hand gestures that don't correspond to any known ceremonial or religious practices, suggesting that these might be representations of Sin communication systems that developed independently of later, more formal sign languages. Itzhal's survival depended on his ability to make himself useful to his community despite his deafness, and he found this usefulness in an unexpected area astronomy and calendar keeping. The Mayan fascination with celestial movements and mathematical calculations created opportunities for individuals whose minds worked in precise, systematic ways. Deaf individuals, freed from the distraction of auditory input, sometimes developed extraordinary abilities to focus on visual patterns and mathematical relationships. The complex Mayan calendar system required constant observation of star positions, planetary movements, and seasonal changes that were entirely visual phenomena. Itzhak might have spent his nights on temple platforms, tracking the movements of Venus across the sky, noting the precise timing of lunar eclipses, or calculating the mathematical relationships that allowed Mayan astronomers to predict celestial events with remarkable accuracy. His deafness, rather than being simply a limitation, became a form of specialized perception that was valuable to his community. While hearing individuals were distracted by the sounds of night birds, wind in the trees, and distant human activity, Itzhak could focus entirely on the subtle visual changes that marked celestial movements. His observations, recorded in the hieroglyphic notation systems that he had learned to read and write, became part of the astronomical knowledge that guided agricultural timing, religious ceremonies, and political decisions. Now travel with me across the Pacific to ancient Japan during the Heian period, when the imperial court in Kyoto was developing some of the world's most sophisticated artistic and literary traditions. Here, in a society that valued aesthetic refinement and subtle communication, we encounter a different kind of adaptation to disability, the development of artistic traditions that transformed limitation into specialized skill. Consider the story of a young woman named Chiyo, who was born blind into a family of minor court officials. In Heian society, where visual beauty was paramount and much of social interaction revolved around the appreciation of seasonal changes, flower arrangements, and elaborate costume designs, blindness might seem like an insurmountable barrier to participation in court life. Yet archaeological evidence from Heian sites suggests that some blind individuals found niches within the artistic traditions that valued non-visual forms of perception and expression. Keo's family, rather than abandoning her, recognized that her blindness might actually enhance certain forms of artistic sensitivity. Japanese aesthetic philosophy during this period emphasized the importance of suggestion over direct representation, the beauty of impermanence, and the value of experiences that engaged senses other than sight. These philosophical frameworks created space for forms of artistic expression that didn't depend primarily on visual perception. Chiyo became a specialist in what the Japanese called mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of the impermanence of all things. Her blindness allowed her to focus entirely on subtle changes in sound, scent, and texture that marked the passage of seasons and the cycles of life and death that formed the core of Heian aesthetic sensibility. She could detect the precise moment when cherry blossoms reached their peak bloom by the changing quality of their fragrance, could identify different varieties of birds by subtle variations in their calls, and could sense the approach of rain or snow through changes in air pressure and humidity that escaped the notice of sighted individuals. These skills made her valuable as a composer of poetry, one of the most prestigious artistic activities in Heian court culture. Her poems, dictated to scribes who could write in the elaborate hiragana script that was becoming the preferred medium for Japanese literary expression, captured seasonal changes and emotional nuances with a precision that amazed her contemporaries. Her blindness, rather than limiting her artistic expression, seemed to intensify her sensitivity to the non-visual elements of experience that formed the foundation of Japanese aesthetic philosophy. Archaeological evidence from Heian sites includes musical instruments and writing materials that suggest blind individuals were integrated into court cultural activities in ways that would have been unimaginable in most other ancient societies. The Japanese emphasis on mono no aware, the awareness of impermanence, created philosophical space for forms of perception and expression that transcended immediate visual experience. Yet we must not romanticize these examples of adaptation and inclusion. Even in societies that found ways to value disabled individuals, their survival remained precarious and dependent on their ability to contribute something unique and valuable to their communities. Chiyo's artistic gifts protected her from abandonment, but they also trapped her within very specific social roles that limited her freedom and autonomy. Return with me now to ancient Mesopotamia, to the great trading cities along the Euphrates River, where merchants from across the known world gathered to exchange goods, ideas, and information. Here we encounter perhaps the most remarkable example of disability adaptation in the ancient world, the development of specialized communication and navigation systems by blind individuals who found ways to participate in the complex networks of trade that connected distant civilizations. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian trading sites suggests that some blind individuals became specialists in what we might call auditory cartography, the ability to navigate complex urban environments and trade routes using sound, scent, and tactile information rather than visual landmarks. These individuals developed mental maps of extraordinary complexity, memorizing the acoustic signatures of different neighborhoods, the distinctive sounds associated with various crafts and trades, and the subtle auditory cues that indicated direction, distance, and location within sprawling urban environments. Imagine a blind merchant named Shamash Din who lost his sight to disease but refused to accept the abandonment that typically awaited disabled individuals in Mesopotamian society. Instead, he developed a form of specialized knowledge that made him valuable to the trading networks that formed the economic backbone of his civilization. Shamash Nadine became expert at identifying the quality and origin of goods through touch, smell, and sound skills that were crucial in an economy where fraud and mislabeling were constant threats. He could identify different grades of wool by the subtle variations in texture and fiber length, could distinguish between genuine and counterfeit precious metals by their weight and sound when struck, and could assess the quality of grains and spices through scent analysis that exceeded the abilities of sighted merchants. These skills made him valuable as an authenticator and quality assessor, roles that required the kind of concentrated sensory analysis that his blindness had forced him to develop. More remarkably, Shamash Nadine developed systems for recording and transmitting information that didn't depend on visual writing systems. He created tactile notation methods using arrangements of small object stones, shells, and pieces of metal that allowed him to keep complex records of transactions, debts, and inventory. These systems were sophisticated enough that other merchants, both blind and sighted, began adopting them for their own record-keeping needs. The archaeological record from Mesopotamian sites includes examples of these tactile notation systems arrangements of small objects found in merchant quarters that appear to represent systematic information storage methods. These discoveries suggest that disabled individuals not only adapted to their environments, but sometimes created innovations that benefited their entire communities. Yet even these remarkable adaptations existed within systems that remained fundamentally hostile to disability. Shamash Nadine's success depended on his ability to make himself so valuable that abandoning him would represent an economic loss to his community. His survival was always conditional, always dependent on maintaining his usefulness in an environment where a single mistake or period of illness could result in exclusion and death. The development of these specialized communication and survival systems by disabled individuals represents one of the most remarkable aspects of human adaptability and creativity. Faced with societies that offered them no accommodation and little compassion, some disabled individuals found ways to transform their limitations into specialized skills that made them valuable to communities that might otherwise have abandoned them. These adaptations required extraordinary creativity, persistence, and courage. They represent not just individual survival strategies, but early examples of the kind of assistive technologies and alternative communication methods that we take for granted in our modern world. The tactile notation systems developed by blind merchants, the sign language gestures created by deaf communities, the specialized sensory skills cultivated by individuals who learned to navigate the world without sight or hearing. All of these represent innovations that expanded human potential and demonstrated the remarkable plasticity of human cognition and communication. As you settle deeper into the comfort of your modern bed, surrounded by the assistive technologies and accessibility features that make contemporary life navigable for people with all kinds of abilities and limitations, remember that these innovations build on thousands of years of human creativity in the face of adversity. The screen readers and voice recognition software, the sign language, interpretation, and closed captioning, the mobility aids and communication devices that enable full participation in modern society. All of these represent the culmination of a long tradition of human ingenuity that began with ancient individuals who refused to accept that disability meant inevitable abandonment or death. Their legacy lives on not just in the specific technologies and techniques they developed, but in their demonstration that human beings possess remarkable abilities to adapt, innovate, and find ways to contribute to their communities, regardless of the physical or sensory limitations they may face. Their stories remind us that disability has never been simply a medical condition or personal tragedy, but a form of human diversity that has always generated its own forms of knowledge, creativity, and wisdom. Sleep now with the knowledge that human adaptability and ingenuity have always found ways to transcend the limitations that societies impose on difference and diversity. Rest peacefully, knowing that the creative solutions developed by ancient disabled individuals continue to inspire and inform our modern efforts to build more inclusive and accessible communities. In the gentle darkness that surrounds you now, as your body settles into the deep rhythms of approaching sleep, let us explore one of the most complex aspects of disability in ancient times: the relationship between healing traditions and disabled individuals, the ways that early medical knowledge both helped and harmed those who lived with physical and sensory differences. Picture yourself in ancient Egypt during the New Kingdom period, perhaps 3,200 years ago, walking through the corridors of the House of Life attached to a great temple complex. The air is redolent with the scent of medicinal herbs, frankincense and myrrh, castor oil and honey, the bitter tang of willow bark that contains what we now know as aspirin. Papyrus scrolls line the walls, covered with hieroglyphic texts that represent some of humanity's earliest systematic attempts to understand and treat the ailments that afflict the human body. Here, in these ancient centers of learning, priest-physicians developed medical knowledge that was remarkably sophisticated for its time. The Edwin Smith papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, contains detailed descriptions of surgical procedures, anatomical observations, and treatment protocols that reveal a level of medical understanding that would not be surpassed in many parts of the world for thousands of years. Yet this same medical tradition embodied profound contradictions in its approach to disability. Egyptian physicians developed treatments for cataracts that could restore sight to some blind individuals, created prosthetic devices for people who had lost limbs, and understood neurological conditions well enough to differentiate between different types of paralysis and cognitive impairment. At the same time, Egyptian medical theory was deeply influenced by religious beliefs that interpreted disability as divine, punishment, or spiritual contamination. Consider the case of a young scribe named Kumhotep, who suffered a severe head injury during a construction accident at one of the Great Pyramid sites. In our modern understanding, his symptoms, partial paralysis, speech difficulties, and cognitive changes would be recognized as the result of traumatic brain injury. Egyptian physicians of his time understood enough about head trauma to attempt treatments that might limit further damage, but their medical interventions were embedded within religious frameworks that fundamentally shaped how they understood both the injury and the person who suffered from it. The medical papyri described treatments for Khemenhotep's condition that combined practical interventions with spiritual rituals. Physicians would clean and dress his wounds using techniques that were surprisingly effective at preventing infection, but they would also perform elaborate ceremonies designed to appease the gods who were believed to have caused his injury as punishment for some moral transgression. This dual approach meant that even when Egyptian medicine successfully treated some aspects of disability, it often reinforced social stigma and spiritual contamination, beliefs that made life more difficult for disabled individuals. A person who received medical treatment for blindness or paralysis might experience some improvement in their physical condition, but they would also carry the social burden of being identified as someone who had incurred divine displeasure. Archaeological evidence from Egyptian medical sites reveals the complexity of these ancient healing practices. Excavations have uncovered surgical instruments sophisticated enough to perform cataract surgery, prosthetic devices crafted with remarkable skill, and pharmaceutical preparations that contained active ingredients we still use in modern medicine. Yet these same sites contain religious artifacts and ritual implements that were used in ceremonies, designed to protect healers from the spiritual contamination that was believed to result from contact with disabled individuals. The medical papyri describe protocols for physicians who treated disabled patients that required elaborate purification rituals before and after treatment. These protocols suggest that even physicians who were willing to help disabled individuals viewed their conditions as fundamentally dangerous and contaminating. The healing relationship was shaped by fear and spiritual anxiety as much as by medical knowledge and therapeutic intent. Travel now with me to ancient Greece, where the development of rational philosophy and systematic observation began to challenge purely religious explanations for disability and disease. In the healing temples dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine, we encounter a different but equally complex relationship between healing traditions and disabled individuals. The Asclepian temples that dotted the Greek world represented some of humanity's earliest attempts at systematic medical treatment combined with what we might now recognize as psychological therapy. Patients would travel from across the Mediterranean to these healing centers, where they would undergo ritual purification, participate in religious ceremonies, and receive treatments that combined herbal medicine, surgical procedures, and what the Greeks called temple sleep, a form of therapeutic dreaming designed to promote healing. Archaeological excavations at Asclepian sites have revealed evidence of remarkably sophisticated medical practices. The healing center at Epidaurus contained surgical instruments, pharmaceutical laboratories, and specialized facilities for treating different types of conditions. Inscribed tablets found at these sites describe successful treatments for blindness, deafness, paralysis, and other conditions that would have been considered incurable in most ancient societies. Yet the Greek healing tradition also embodied assumptions about disability that were deeply problematic. The concept of catharsis, purification, that was central to Greek medical theory, suggested that disability resulted from spiritual pollution that needed to be cleansed rather than simply treated. Disabled individuals who sought healing at the Asclepian temples were required to undergo laboric purification rituals that reinforced the idea that their conditions were fundamentally contaminating and shameful. Moreover, the Greek emphasis on physical perfection as a reflection of moral and spiritual virtue meant that even successful medical treatments carried implicit messages about the inferiority of disabled bodies and minds. A person who regained sight or hearing through treatment at an Asclepian was not simply recovering from a medical condition, but was being restored to full moral and spiritual status after a period of degradation. The medical writings of physicians like Hippocrates and Galen reveal this tension between empirical observation and moral judgment. These ancient physicians developed remarkably accurate descriptions of various disabilities and their causes, but they embedded these descriptions within theoretical frameworks that interpreted disability as evidence of fundamental imbalance, weakness, or moral failing. Hippocrates' theory of the four humours, for example, provided a systematic way of understanding different types of disability as the result of specific imbalances in bodily fluids. This theory was sophisticated enough to guide effective treatments for some conditions, but it also suggested that disabled individuals were fundamentally different from and inferior to people whose humours were properly balanced. Now journey with me to ancient China, where traditional medicine developed approaches to disability that were shaped by different philosophical traditions, but that embodied many of the same contradictions between healing and harm. The concept of key life energy that was central to Chinese medical theory provided frameworks for understanding disability that were less morally judgmental than Greek or Egyptian approaches, but that still reinforced ideas about disabled individuals as fundamentally different from normal people. Chinese medical texts describe treatments for blindness, deafness, and paralysis that were remarkably sophisticated and that sometimes achieved significant therapeutic success. Acupuncture, herbal medicine, and various forms of physical therapy were used to treat conditions that other ancient medical traditions considered incurable. Archaeological evidence from Chinese medical sites includes surgical instruments, pharmaceutical preparations, and treatment facilities that rival anything found in the ancient Mediterranean world. Yet Chinese medicine also embodied assumptions about disability that could be deeply harmful to disabled individuals. The theory of Qi suggested that disability resulted from blockages or imbalances in life energy that reflected fundamental disharmony between the individual and the natural order. This theoretical framework implied that disabled people were not simply ill, but were living in a state of cosmic discord that required correction. More problematically, Chinese medical theory suggested that disability could be contagious, that contact with disabled individuals could disrupt the qi of healthy people and cause them to develop similar conditions. This belief led to isolation practices that separated disabled individuals from their communities even when they were receiving medical treatment. The archaeological record from Chinese medical sites reveals evidence of these isolation practices in the form of specialized treatment facilities that were physically separated from main hospital complexes and that contained living quarters designed more like prisons than therapeutic environments. Disabled patients might receive excellent medical care, but they received it in conditions of confinement and social exclusion that reinforced their marginalization. Perhaps most complex of all was the relationship between healing traditions and disabled individuals in the Islamic world during the medieval period, when Islamic physicians developed medical knowledge that surpassed anything available in contemporary Europe, while also creating institutional systems for caring for disabled individuals that were unprecedented in their scope and sophistication. The Bimaristan hospitals that were established in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo represented revolutionary approaches to medical care that included specialized wards for blind, deaf, and mentally ill patients. These institutions provided not just medical treatment, but also occupational training, social support, and long-term care that enabled many disabled individuals to live productive and dignified lives. Archaeological evidence from Bimaristan sites reveals facilities that were designed with remarkable attention to the specific needs of disabled patients. Special architectural features accommodated blind individuals. Communication systems were developed for deaf patients, and therapeutic programs were created for people with cognitive impairments. These hospitals represented perhaps the most advanced approach to disability care in the ancient world. Yet even these progressive institutions were shaped by religious and medical theories that could be harmful to disabled individuals. Islamic medical theory, while more empirically based than many earlier traditions, still interpreted some forms of disability as divine tests or punishments that required spiritual as well as medical intervention. Disabled patients in Bimaristan hospitals received excellent care, but they also received religious instruction designed to help them understand their conditions as opportunities for spiritual growth through suffering. The complex legacy of ancient healing traditions reminds us that medical knowledge has always been embedded within broader cultural, religious, and philosophical frameworks that shape how societies understand and respond to disability. The same medical advances that enabled some disabled individuals to recover function or live more comfortably also reinforced beliefs and practices that marginalized and stigmatized people with disabilities. As you settle deeper into sleep, surrounded by the benefits of modern medicine that can treat many conditions that were incurable in ancient times, remember that our contemporary medical system still grapples with some of the same tensions between healing and harm that characterized ancient healing traditions. The medicalization of disability can provide crucial support and treatment, But it can also reinforce deficit-based thinking that focuses on what disabled individuals cannot do rather than celebrating the diverse ways that human beings experience and navigate the world. The ancient healers whose work we've explored tonight were pioneers who developed knowledge and techniques that still inform modern medicine. But they were also products of their times who embedded their healing practices within belief systems that could be deeply harmful to the people they sought to help. Their legacy reminds us that medical progress is never simply a matter of technical advancement, but requires ongoing attention to the values, assumptions, and social frameworks that shape how healing knowledge is developed and applied. Rest now in the knowledge that human beings have always sought to heal and help one another, even when their efforts were constrained by the limitations of their times and cultures. Sleep peacefully, grateful for the medical advances that have made life better for millions of disabled individuals, while remaining mindful of the ongoing work needed to ensure that healing traditions truly serve the dignity and well-being of all people. As the night reaches its deepest point and your consciousness hovers in the liminal space between waking and sleeping, let us turn our attention to perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of disability in ancient times: the fate of children born with differences, and the impossible choices that families faced when economic survival warred against parental love. Picture yourself in a small farming village in Bronze Age Europe, perhaps 4,000 years ago, during the harsh grip of a winter that has already claimed several elderly members of the community and threatens to exhaust the carefully rationed stores of grain that must last until spring planting. The air inside the circular thatched dwelling is thick with smoke from the central fire, heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies and the earthy smell of stored root vegetables. Outside, snow falls steadily, adding to drifts that have already made hunting impossible and travel deadly. In this desperate environment, you witness one of the most terrible dilemmas that ancient families face: the birth of a child who will never be able to contribute to the family's survival. The infant, born just days ago, shows clear signs of what we would now recognize as congenital blindness. Her eyes do not track movement, do not respond to light, and her parents slowly, agonizingly, come to understand that their daughter will never see their faces, never learn to avoid the dangers that constantly threaten the community, never participate in the visual skills that farming and survival require. The decision that faces this family is not simply about one child's future, but about the survival of everyone in the household. Food stores are calculated to feed a specific number of people through the remaining winter months. Adding another person who cannot contribute to food gathering, cannot help with crucial tasks like watching for predators or tending fires, cannot even be taught the essential skills of survival because they cannot see. Demonstrations this addition might mean that everyone in the family starves before spring returns. Archaeological evidence from Bronze Age sites across Europe reveals the tragic frequency of this dilemma. Excavations of ancient settlements consistently show higher rates of infant mortality in winter months, and closer examination of infant remains often reveals evidence of exposure rather than disease or natural death. Small bodies found outside settlement boundaries, showing signs of having died from cold rather than violence or illness, tell the silent story of families forced to choose between the survival of one child and the survival of all. But to truly understand the weight of these ancient choices, we must look beyond the statistical evidence and try to imagine the emotional reality of parents forced to abandon children they loved. The archaeological record cannot capture the tears, the sleepless nights, the desperate search for alternatives that surely preceded these terrible decisions. It cannot record the anguish of mothers who carry children for 9 months only to leave them outside the village boundaries, or the grief of fathers who may have volunteered to perform this terrible duty to spare their wives the burden. In some ancient societies, the practice of infant exposure was formalized into religious or legal rituals that provided psychological distance from what was essentially the killing of children. The Roman practice of exposing unwanted infants at designated sites was regulated by law and sanctified by religious tradition, making it easier for families to participate in what would otherwise have been unthinkable acts. Roman legal texts describe the process in clinical terms that mask its emotional reality. Fathers were required to examine newborn children and decide within a specified time period whether to accept them into the family or to expose them outside the city walls. Children with obvious disabilities were automatically subject to exposure. But even healthy children might be abandoned if the family could not afford to raise them or if their gender was not desired. Archaeological excavations at Roman exposure sites have revealed hundreds of infant remains, many showing signs of disabilities that would have been visible at birth. But among these remains are also perfectly healthy children, whose only crime was being born at the wrong time, or two families who could not support them. The practice of exposure, while often applied to disabled children, was actually a broader mechanism for family economic planning that treated all children as conditional members of the household, whose acceptance depended on circumstances beyond their control. The psychological mechanisms that allowed families to participate in these practices reveal the complex ways that ancient societies managed the contradiction between parental love and survival necessity. Many cultures developed beliefs that infants did not acquire full human souls until they had survived a certain period, days, weeks, or even months after birth. This belief system made it psychologically easier to abandon newborns, because they were not yet considered fully human in the same way that older children were. Archaeological evidence suggests that some families attempted to find middle ground between outright abandonment and the impossible burden of caring for disabled children. Remains of disabled infants found at exposure sites sometimes show evidence of having been left with small amounts of food or wrapped in clothing, suggesting that parents hope someone might find and rescue their children, even as they acknowledge their inability to care for them personally. Some exposure sites were located near temples or wealthy households, where there was a possibility that abandoned children might be discovered and adopted. While this possibility was remote and survival rates were low, it provided a psychological cushion that allowed parents to believe they were giving their children a chance at life rather than simply condemning them to death. The practice of abandoning disabled children was not limited to times of obvious crisis or economic hardship. Even in relatively prosperous periods, families faced the long-term challenge of caring for children who would never become economically productive adults. A blind or deaf child represented not just the immediate cost of feeding and sheltering them, but the prospect of supporting a dependent adult for decades into the future. In ancient agricultural societies, where survival depended on every family member contributing to essential tasks, disabled children posed economic calculations that extended far beyond childhood. Parents had to consider not just whether they could feed an additional child through the next winter, but whether they could support a non-productive adult for potentially decades, whether other children would be disadvantaged by the resources diverted to caring for a disabled sibling, and whether the family line could continue if too many resources were invested in members who could not reproduce or contribute economically. Archaeological evidence from ancient Chinese sites reveals practices that attempted to address these long-term concerns through forms of selective care that provided disabled children with basic survival needs, while limiting the resources invested in their development. Some disabled children were kept alive, but were not provided with the education, training, or social integration that would have been given to their non-disabled siblings. Excavations of ancient Chinese households have revealed evidence of separate living areas for disabled family members, suggesting that these individuals were maintained as part of the household but were not fully integrated into family life. They received food and shelter, but were excluded from the social and educational experiences that prepared other children for adult roles in the community. This practice of partial inclusion represented a compromise between the impossibility of full abandonment and the difficulty of providing complete care and integration. It allowed families to maintain some connection to disabled children while limiting the economic and social costs of their care. Yet this compromise came at the cost of condemning disabled children to lives of permanent marginalization and dependence, never allowed to develop their full potential or to find their own ways of contributing to their communities. Perhaps most tragically, archaeological evidence suggests that many ancient societies had little understanding of the potential that disabled children might possess if given appropriate support and accommodation. Modern research has shown that children who are blind from birth often develop enhanced abilities in other sensory areas, that deaf children can develop sophisticated visual communication skills, and that many forms of cognitive difference can be accompanied by unique strengths and abilities. But ancient societies, focused on immediate survival needs and lacking the knowledge and resources for accommodation, rarely gave disabled children the chance to develop these alternative abilities. A blind child who might have become a skilled musician, storyteller, or keeper of oral traditions was abandoned before anyone could discover these potential talents. A deaf child who might have developed exceptional visual skills or artistic abilities was excluded from the community before their unique gifts could emerge. The archaeological record contains tantalizing hints of what might have been occasional graves of disabled individuals who lived to adulthood and were buried with grave goods, suggesting they had achieved some form of social recognition or economic contribution. These rare examples remind us of the human potential that was lost when societies chose abandonment over accommodation, immediate economic calculation over long-term investment in human development. As you settle deeper into the comfort of your modern bed, surrounded by the safety net of contemporary disability support systems, consider the weight of these ancient choices and their ongoing legacy. The decision to abandon disabled children was not made by unusually cruel or heartless people, but by families facing impossible choices between individual compassion and collective survival. Yet these historical realities also remind us of how far human societies have traveled in recognizing the inherent worth and potential of all children, regardless of their abilities or differences. The modern commitment to providing education, support, and accommodation for disabled children represents one of humanity's greatest moral achievements, a recognition that the value of human life transcends immediate economic utility. The children whose stories we've explored tonight, the blind infants left at exposure sites, the deaf babies abandoned outside village boundaries, the cognitively different children excluded from family life, did not die in vain if their memory helps us appreciate the precious value of the inclusive educational systems, early intervention programs, and family support services that enable disabled children today to grow, learn, and contribute to their communities in ways their ancient counterparts could never have imagined. Sleep now with gratitude for the progress that has transformed childhood, disability from a death sentence into an opportunity for different forms of human flourishing. Rest peacefully, knowing that every accommodation made for disabled children today honors the memory of those ancient children who were denied the chance to discover their own unique gifts and contributions to human community. As the deep hours of night enfold you and your journey toward sleep becomes almost complete, let us explore one of the most paradoxical aspects of disability in ancient times: the ways that some cultures transformed physical and mental differences from signs of divine punishment into marks of divine favor, creating complex religious traditions that both elevated and isolated disabled individuals within their communities. Picture yourself in ancient Ireland during the Celtic period, perhaps 1500 years ago, standing in a sacred grove where massive oak trees create a natural cathedral beneath the star-filled sky. The air is redolent with the scent of burning herbs, vervain and mistletoe. Rowan and hawthorn wild druids in white robes perform ceremonies that connect the human community to the complex web of supernatural forces that were believed to govern every aspect of life and death. Among these religious leaders, you encounter individuals whose disabilities have been reinterpreted through Celtic spiritual understanding as signs of divine election rather than divine punishment. Here stands a young woman named Brigid, whose blindness, rather than marking her for abandonment, has qualified her for training as a seer, one who can perceive truths hidden from ordinary sight because her physical eyes have been closed to the material world. Celtic religious philosophy embraced the concept of second sight, the belief that some individuals possessed supernatural abilities to perceive future events, communicate with spirits, and understand hidden aspects of reality that were invisible to people with normal vision. Blindness, rather than being simply a medical condition, was sometimes interpreted as evidence that the gods had traded physical sight for spiritual vision, creating individuals who could serve as intermediaries between the human and supernatural worlds. Brigid's training as a druid involved years of memorizing vast quantities of oral tradition genealogies, laws, religious ceremonies, historical accounts, and poetic compositions that preserved the cultural knowledge of her people. Her blindness, which would have excluded her from most other social roles, actually enhanced her ability to focus on auditory learning and memorization. The Celtic educational system, based entirely on oral transmission, created opportunities for blind individuals that written cultures would not provide. Archaeological evidence from Celtic ritual sites includes specialized architectural features that suggest some disabled individuals held positions of religious authority. Stone circles and ceremonial spaces contain acoustic elements, carefully positioned stones that amplify and direct sound that would have been particularly valuable for blind religious leaders who needed to project their voices to large gatherings. The sophisticated understanding of acoustics demonstrated in these ancient constructions suggests that Celtic communities invested significant resources in accommodating disabled religious leaders. Yet this religious elevation of disability came with profound costs. Brigid's spiritual authority depended entirely on maintaining her role as a sacred outsider, permanently separated from normal human relationships and experiences. Celtic religious law forbade druids from marrying, owning property, or participating in the economic and social activities that gave meaning to most people's lives. Her blindness, reinterpreted as divine gift, became the foundation of a life of enforced isolation and dependency. Moreover, the Celtic understanding of sacred disability was highly selective and often arbitrary. A person born blind might be elevated to religious authority, while someone who became deaf later in life might be abandoned or marginalized. The same culture that honored Brigid's blindness as evidence of divine favor might interpret another person's epilepsy as evidence of demonic possession requiring exile or death. Travel now with me to ancient Greece, where different philosophical and religious traditions created alternative frameworks for understanding the relationship between disability and divine will. In the mountainous regions of northern Greece, you encounter the worship of Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and divine madness, whose religious festivals created space for individuals whose behavior and perception differed dramatically from social norms. The Dionysiac mysteries attracted individuals who experienced what we might now recognize as mental illness, neurological conditions, or cognitive differences. Rather than being excluded from religious life, these individuals were sometimes interpreted as being possessed by the god. Their unusual behaviors and perceptions understood as manifestations of divine presence rather than symptoms of pathology. Archaeological evidence from Dionysiac ritual sites includes inscriptions and artistic representations that suggest some disabled individuals played central roles in religious ceremonies. The god himself was often depicted with characteristics that would have been considered disabilities in ordinary social context: wild, uncontrolled behavior, sensory distortions, and forms of consciousness that departed radically from rational, ordered thinking. The religious framework of Dionysiac worship created space for forms of human experience and expression that were marginalized or pathologized in other contexts. Individuals whose cognitive or emotional differences made them unsuitable for conventional social roles could find acceptance and even reverence within religious communities that valued ecstatic experience and divine possession over rational discourse and practical productivity. Yet this religious inclusion was deeply ambivalent and often exploitative. Disabled individuals who were interpreted as divinely possessed were valued not for their inherent human dignity, but for their utility as conduits for supernatural experience. They were honored as vessels of divine presence, while being denied recognition as autonomous individuals with their own thoughts, feelings, and desires. The archaeological record from Dionysiac sites reveals evidence of this exploitation in the form of restraining devices and specialized living quarters that suggest disabled individuals were kept in conditions more like captivity than religious honor. While they were revered during ritual ceremonies, they lived under constant supervision and control, their unusual behaviors managed and directed by religious authorities who claimed to interpret divine will. Now journey with me across the ancient world to the temples of Egypt, where different traditions of sacred disability developed around the worship of gods who were themselves depicted with various physical differences. The god base, protector of households and children, was portrayed as a dwarf with distinctive facial features that would have marked him as disabled by ancient Egyptian standards. Yet rather than being shameful or contaminating, these physical differences were understood as sources of protective power. Archaeological evidence from Egyptian temples dedicated to base includes specialized facilities for disabled individuals who served as temple attendants and ritual specialists. These individuals were not simply objects of charity, but were understood to embody the protective power of their patron deity. Their physical differences, rather than being obstacles to religious service, were interpreted as qualifications that made them particularly effective in their sacred roles. The Egyptian concept of Heka, magical power, created frameworks for understanding disability that were more positive than those found in many other ancient cultures. Physical differences could be interpreted as signs of magical potency rather than divine punishment, creating opportunities for disabled individuals to achieve positions of respect and authority within religious institutions. Yet, even in these relatively positive religious contexts, disabled individuals remained vulnerable to changing theological interpretations and political pressures. A person whose physical differences were interpreted as signs of divine favor under one religious administration might find themselves reclassified as contaminated or cursed if political or theological winds shifted. Archaeological evidence from Egyptian temple sites reveals the precarious nature of these religious positions in the form of burial practices that changed over time. Early period burials of disabled temple attendants show elaborate grave goods and honored placement within temple complexes, while later period burials from the same sites show simpler interments and less prestigious locations, suggesting that attitudes towards sacred disability evolved in response to changing religious and political circumstances. The most complex example of sacred disability in the ancient world developed in the religious traditions of ancient Mesopotamia, where disabled individuals sometimes achieved the ultimate religious honor of being selected as human representatives of the gods themselves. The practice of sacred prostitution in temples dedicated to Ishtar and other fertility deities included disabled individuals whose physical differences were interpreted as signs of divine selection. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian temple complexes includes specialized living quarters and ritual spaces, designed for disabled religious personnel who served lifelong commitments to specific deities. These individuals were provided with food, shelter, and social status that would have been impossible to achieve in secular contexts. But they were also subjected to forms of control and exploitation that completely eliminated their personal autonomy. The Mesopotamian understanding of sacred disability was embedded within broader religious frameworks that emphasized the absolute authority of divine will over human experience. Disabled individuals who were selected for religious service were understood to have been marked by the gods for special purposes that transcended ordinary human concerns about productivity, marriage, or social integration. Yet this religious elevation came at the cost of complete dehumanization. Sacred disabled individuals were treated as living representations of divine presence, rather than as human beings with their own needs, desires, and rights. They were honored and feared in equal measure, revered for their connection to supernatural power while being isolated from normal human relationships and experiences. The archaeological record from these Mesopotamian sites reveals the psychological and physical toll of this sacred isolation. Analysis of remains from temple burial grounds shows evidence of mental health conditions, social isolation effects, and physical deterioration that suggest many sacred disabled individuals suffered greatly despite their honored religious status. Perhaps most tragically, the religious frameworks that elevated some disabled individuals to sacred status often made life more difficult for disabled people who were not selected for religious roles. The very existence of sacred disability created hierarchies that distinguished between disabilities that were divinely significant and those that were simply medical conditions or personal limitations. A person whose blindness was interpreted as qualification for religious service might achieve high status and community support, while another blind individual in the same community might face abandonment or neglect because their disability was not considered religiously significant. The religious interpretation of disability created systems of privilege and exclusion that were often more arbitrary and cruel than purely secular approaches to human difference. Archaeological evidence from ancient religious sites across the world reveals this pattern of selective inclusion and exclusion. Temple complexes contain evidence of elaborate care and accommodation for some disabled individuals, alongside evidence of the exclusion and marginalization of others whose disabilities were not considered religiously significant. The legacy of sacred disability traditions in ancient cultures reveals the complex ways that religious belief systems shaped social responses to human difference. These traditions demonstrate both the human capacity to find meaning and value in forms of diversity that purely utilitarian thinking would reject, and the dangers of treating disabled individuals as symbols or representatives of supernatural forces rather than as human beings with inherent dignity and worth. As you settle into the deepest stages of sleep, surrounded by the safety and inclusion of modern secular society, consider the complex legacy of these ancient religious approaches to disability. The recognition that human difference could be sacred and meaningful represents an important step toward understanding disability as a form of diversity rather than simply deficiency or pathology. Yet the exploitation and dehumanization that often accompanied religious elevation of disabled individuals reminds us that inclusion without recognition of full human autonomy and dignity remains fundamentally inadequate. The disabled individuals who achieved religious honor in ancient cultures paid a heavy price for their elevation, trading personal freedom and authentic human relationships for social status and material security. Their stories remind us that true inclusion requires not just recognition of the value that disabled individuals can contribute to their communities, but respect for their inherent human dignity and their right to make their own choices about how to live their lives. The modern disability rights movement's emphasis on autonomy, self-determination, and full citizenship represents a crucial evolution beyond the paternalistic patterns that characterized even the most positive ancient approaches to disability. Sleep now with gratitude for the progress that has enabled disabled individuals to participate in religious and spiritual life on their own terms, as full human beings rather than as sacred symbols or divine representatives. Rest peacefully, knowing that the complex legacy of ancient sacred disability continues to inform our understanding of the relationship between human difference and spiritual meaning, while reminding us of the ongoing work needed to ensure that all forms of inclusion truly honor the full humanity of disabled individuals. As the deepest hour of night embraces you and your consciousness drifts toward the peaceful realm of sleep, let us conclude our long journey through the shadows of ancient history with a final meditation on perhaps the most profound truth that emerges from these difficult stories: that disability, in all its forms, represents not an aberration from the human condition, but rather its most honest expression. Picture yourself standing once more at the threshold between the ancient and modern worlds, but this time with the weight of all the stories we've shared settling around you like layers of accumulated wisdom. The archaeological evidence, the individual tales of survival and abandonment, the religious transformations and medical interventions, the moments of cruelty and flashes of compassion of these experiences have woven themselves into a complex understanding of what it means to be human in a world that has never been designed for human flourishing. For in the end, what we discover through our exploration of ancient disability is not simply that disabled individuals faced particular hardships in earlier times, but that the vulnerability, dependence, and impermanence that disability represents are actually fundamental characteristics of the human experience that most people, most of the time, simply manage to forget or avoid confronting directly. Every human being is born utterly helpless, completely dependent on others for survival, unable to walk, talk, feed themselves, or navigate the world without constant care and protection. Every human being will, if they live long enough, experience the gradual loss of abilities they once took for granted: the dimming of sight, the fading of hearing, the slowing of movement, the clouding of memory. Every human being lives in a body that is fragile, temporary, and subject to sudden change through accident, illness, or simply the passage of time. The ancient societies we've studied were perhaps more honest about these fundamental realities than our modern culture often allows itself to be. Their harsh treatment of disabled individuals, while morally unacceptable, emerged from clear-eyed recognition of human vulnerability and the precarious nature of survival in a world that offers no guarantees of safety, comfort, or continued existence. The archaeological evidence we've examined reveals not just the particular sufferings of disabled individuals, but the universal human condition of impermanence and interdependence that disability makes visible. The abandoned infants, the excluded adults, the individuals who survived through extraordinary adaptation or compassionate care. All of these stories illuminate truths about human nature and social organization that apply far beyond the specific experience of disability. Consider the fundamental insight that emerges from our study of ancient economic systems and their treatment of disabled individuals. That human worth, as measured by social institutions, has almost always been conditional, dependent on one's ability to contribute to collective survival needs. This insight reveals something disturbing, not just about ancient attitudes toward disability, but about the persistent tendency of human societies to measure value through productivity, utility, and economic contribution. The disabled individuals in ancient times who were abandoned or killed were not fundamentally different from their non-disabled peers. They were simply less able to hide or postpone the reckoning with dependency and vulnerability that awaits every human being. Their exclusion from community life represented a collective denial of the fragility and interdependence that characterize all human existence. The religious frameworks we've explored, which sometimes elevated disabled individuals to sacred status, while often isolating them from normal human relationships, reveal another fundamental aspect of human psychology: the tendency to manage anxiety about vulnerability and mortality by creating categories of others who embody the fears and limitations that everyone shares but few want to acknowledge. The disabled individuals who were interpreted as divinely marked, whether for punishment or for special favor, served as repositories for collective anxieties about human limitation and impermanence. By treating them as fundamentally different, ancient societies could maintain the illusion that disability was something that happened to other people rather than a potential future that awaited everyone. Yet our journey through these difficult histories has also revealed the remarkable human capacity for adaptation, creativity, and mutual support that emerges precisely from recognition of shared vulnerability. The most inspiring stories we've encountered, the communities that chose to care for disabled members despite resource constraints, the individuals who developed innovative survival strategies, the religious traditions that found sacred meaning in human difference, represent responses to the fundamental challenge of creating meaning and community in the face of universal human fragility. The archaeological evidence of care and accommodation, rare though it may be in the ancient record, points toward possibilities that transcend the utilitarian calculations that dominated most historical societies. These examples suggest that human beings possess the capacity to recognize value and meaning that extends beyond immediate economic contribution, and to create forms of community that embrace rather than deny the vulnerability and interdependence that characterize human existence. The gradual historical evolution toward more inclusive approaches to disability that we've traced represents not simply moral progress in the treatment of a particular group, but a growing recognition of fundamental truths about human nature and social organization that apply to everyone. The modern disability rights movement's emphasis on accommodation, inclusion, and recognition of human dignity regardless of ability represents a profound challenge to social systems that have historically measured worth through productivity and independence. But this evolution also reveals the ongoing tension between the reality of human interdependence and social ideologies that celebrate individual autonomy and self-sufficiency. Even in our modern world, with all its technological capabilities and legal protections, disabled individuals continue to face barriers and discrimination that reflect deeper cultural anxieties about dependency, vulnerability, and the conditional nature of social acceptance. The stories we've shared tonight remind us that the exclusion and marginalization of disabled individuals throughout history has never been simply about practical limitations or resource constraints, but about collective denial of the fundamental characteristics of human existence that disability makes visible. The fear, rejection, and violence that disabled individuals have faced across cultures and centuries reflects broader human anxieties about mortality, dependence, and the arbitrary nature of physical and cognitive abilities. Yet these same stories also point toward the possibility of creating forms of community and meaning that embrace rather than deny human vulnerability. The occasional examples of care, inclusion, and recognition that we've discovered in the archaeological record suggest that human societies can choose to organize themselves around principles of mutual support and shared responsibility, rather than individual competition and utilitarian calculation. The technological capabilities of our modern world have created unprecedented opportunities to realize these possibilities. We possess the knowledge and resources to create environments that accommodate human diversity, to develop assistive technologies that overcome traditional barriers, and to structure economic and social systems that value all forms of human contribution. The question is whether we will choose to use these capabilities to build more inclusive communities, or whether we will continue to perpetuate ancient patterns of exclusion and marginalization in new forms. As you drift into sleep, surrounded by the comfort and safety of contemporary life, let yourself feel both the weight of this long human journey and the hope that it represents. The disabled individuals whose stories we've explored tonight, from the abandoned infants of prehistoric settlements to the sacred outcasts of ancient temples, were not separate from the human story, but were its most honest representatives. Their experiences illuminate truths about vulnerability, interdependence, and the search for meaning and community that apply to all human beings. Their suffering was not meaningless if it helps us understand the precious value of the inclusion and accommodation that we sometimes take for granted, and if it motivates us to continue the work of building communities that truly embrace the full diversity of human experience. The ancient darkness through which we've traveled together tonight has not been conquered, but has been illuminated by the gradual growth of human compassion and understanding. The light that allows us to see the cruelty and exclusion of the past also reveals the ongoing possibilities for creating more inclusive and compassionate forms of community. Sleep now in the knowledge that you are part of this continuing evolution, this slow but persistent expansion of human moral imagination that has brought us from the harsh survival calculations of ancient times to our modern recognition of universal human dignity. Rest peacefully, knowing that the work of inclusion and accommodation continues in countless small acts of daily kindness, understanding, and mutual support that honor the memory of all those who were denied the chance to contribute their unique gifts to human community, and wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for the fragile, precious, and ultimately shared nature of human existence, for the recognition that we are all, in the end, temporarily able-bodied travelers making our way through a world that requires not individual perfection, but collective compassion, not independent self-sufficiency, but interdependent care for one another. Good night, dear listener. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but necessary journey through the shadows and light of human history. May your dreams be gentle, and may you wake tomorrow with deeper understanding of both the darkness and the hope that have always coexisted in the human heart. The ancient stories we've shared tonight live on in every act of inclusion, every moment of accommodation, and every choice to value human dignity over immediate utility. Sleep well, knowing that the long night of exclusion is slowly giving way to a dawn of understanding that recognizes disability not as tragedy or inspiration, but as part of the natural diversity of human experience that enriches rather than burdens our shared communities. The future remains unwritten, and you are part of the continuing story of human moral evolution that began in those ancient settlements and continues in the choices we make each day about how to treat one another with dignity, respect, and love. Rest now in peace, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations who have slowly, imperfectly, but persistently learned to see the sacred worth that resides in every human soul, regardless of ability or difference. The darkness has lifted, and a new day of possibility awaits.